I always believed that honesty was the bedrock of a good marriage. From the moment Emma and I got together, that was our thing. No secrets. We both worked hard, made time for each other, and had built a decent life together. At least that's what I thought. It started subtly, like how cracks form slowly in the foundation of a house. Emma started coming home late from work more often than usual. At first, I didn't question it. She worked in PR, and that meant long hours, events, and unpredictable meetings. But one night, she didn't come home at all. I remember the cold sweat that hit me when I woke up at 2 a.m. and realized her side of the bed was still empty. I tried calling, texting, and nothing. Panic set in. I thought something terrible had happened, like a car accident. I called the hospitals, but nothing. When she finally strolled through the door at 6 a.m., the sight of her disheveled hair and smeared makeup said everything before she even opened her mouth. "Oh, sorry," she mumbled, tossing her purse onto the couch, avoiding my eyes. I fell asleep at Sarah's after the work event. Sarah, her best friend, was the perfect alibi, except something about the way she said it didn't sit right with me. She never stayed out. Ever. The moment she disappeared into the shower, I grabbed her phone off the table. Her lock screen lit up with a message. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait for next time." My stomach dropped. I scrolled further, and there it was. A string of messages between her and a guy named Ben. Explicit messages, pictures, and it hit me like a punch in the gut. My wife, the woman I thought I knew inside and out, had been having an affair. But I didn't confront her right then. I needed time to process this new reality. So I put the phone back where I found it, my mind racing with the dozens of excuses she had given over the last few months. The work trips, the late night meetings, the sudden interest in going out with friends more frequently. How had I not seen it? As I sat there trying to calm the storm of emotions building inside me, I realized I wasn't just angry. I was terrified of what this meant for us, for our future. We'd been married for 7 years, and in all that time I thought we had built something strong, unshakable. Yet here I was, staring at the truth I couldn't deny. The rest of that day felt like walking through a fog. Emma acted like nothing had happened, breezing around the house, chatting about mundane things like groceries and plans for the weekend. I just stared at her, trying to reconcile the person in front of me with the one from those messages. Every time I opened my mouth to confront her, the words got stuck. What could I say? I had no idea how to even begin. The anger I expected to feel was swallowed by this deep, gnawing sadness. The idea of our marriage being a lie made it hard to even breathe. So I stayed quiet. I started paying more attention to the small things. The way her phone never left her side. The way she smiled a little too easily at certain texts. Her laughter at something on her screen when she thought I wasn't looking. All the little signs I'd ignored for months, maybe even longer, now screamed at me. One night, a week after I'd found those messages, Emma had another work event. This time, I decided to follow her. It was easier than I expected. She left the house in a sleek black dress, one she hadn't worn in ages, her makeup done with more care than usual. She kissed me on the cheek, something she rarely did anymore, and said she wouldn't be late. I waited 10 minutes, grabbed my jacket, and followed. Her event wasn't at some upscale restaurant or hotel ballroom. She drove to a quiet part of town, a neighborhood we never had any reason to visit. I parked a few blocks away and watched from the shadows as she walked into a small, unassuming bar. And there he was, Ben, sitting in a booth near the back, grinning as she approached. They embraced. It wasn't just a friendly hug. It was the kind of touch filled with all the things I used to see in her eyes when she looked at me. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched them order drinks, laughing and leaning into each other. At that moment, I realized this wasn't some one-off affair. It wasn't some fling that had just happened. This was something deeper, and I had no idea how long it had been going on. I wanted to storm in there, scream at them both, make a scene, but I didn't. I just stood there, frozen, staring at the woman I loved, and the man she was now laughing with like I didn't exist. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life. I thought about calling her out right then and there. I thought about walking up to the table and seeing how they reacted. But instead, I turned around and left. My mind too scrambled to think straight. That night, she came home around midnight. She smelled of alcohol and the faintest hint of cologne that wasn't mine. She kissed me again, mumbled something about how fun the event was, and went straight to bed. I stood in the kitchen, staring at her empty wine glass on the counter, wondering how long I could keep pretending. pretending I didn't know, pretending we still had something left to save. But I couldn't pretend forever. The days that followed were a nightmare of confusion and paranoia. It wasn't just the messages or the late nights anymore. It was the sinking feeling in my gut every time I looked at her. Every smile she gave me felt hollow. Every touch left me cold. The worst part was she still acted as if everything was normal, as if we were still the same couple who once spent lazy Sundays wrapped up in each other's arms, dreaming about our future. But I couldn't ask her about it. How could I? I was the one sneaking through her phone, following her like some stalker. I was the one collecting evidence, waiting for the right moment to confront her, and yet, I couldn't bring myself to say the words. Instead, I began to withdraw. We'd always shared everything, our days, our thoughts, our worries, but now I started keeping things inside. I stopped asking her how her day went. I stopped sharing stories from work. I stopped making an effort, hoping maybe she'd notice. Maybe she'd feel the distance growing between us and ask what was wrong. But she didn't. It was as if I had become invisible to her. One evening, after she'd had another late meeting, I found myself staring at our wedding photos. There was one in particular that I couldn't take my eyes off. It was taken just after the ceremony, the two of us laughing, completely in love, not a care in the world. I looked at my younger self in that photo, full of hope and joy, and I felt a pang of bitterness. How had we ended up here? That night, something in me snapped. I couldn't just sit by and let this happen. I decided I needed more than just vague suspicions and secret texts. I needed undeniable proof. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I hired a private investigator. The PI's name was Carl, a grizzled man in his 50s with a no-nonsense attitude. He didn't seem surprised when I explained my situation. "Happens more often than you'd think," he said, scribbling down the details. "Give me a week, and I'll get you what you need." I didn't sleep much that week. Every time Emma left the house, I wondered where she was really going. I imagined her with Ben, sharing private moments, laughing at me behind my back. The constant doubt gnawed at me until I felt like I was losing my mind. On the seventh day, Carl called. "Meet me at my office," and he said, "I've got something for you." When I arrived, Carl didn't say much. He slid a manila folder across the desk, gave me a sympathetic look, and said, "It's all in there." My hands trembled as I opened the folder. Inside were photos, dozens of them. Emma and Ben meeting at the same bar I'd followed her to, walking through the park, holding hands like a couple of teenagers. And then, the most damning ones, photos of them entering a hotel together, her in that same black dress, him grinning like he'd won the lottery. There was no mistaking what had happened next. I closed the folder, my heart pounding in my chest. It was real. I had the proof. Now there was no way I could avoid it any longer. I had to confront her. But how? How could I bring this up without exploding, without tearing our lives apart? I drove home that night with the folder in the passenger seat, glancing at it every now and then like it was a ticking time bomb. By the time I got home, Emma was already in bed, fast asleep. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, staring at her peaceful face, wondering how someone who could betray me so completely could look so calm, so innocent. For the next few days, I rehearsed what I would say. I imagined different scenarios, each one ending in either a screaming match or silence. But before I could decide on the right approach, something else happened that forced my hand. It was a Thursday evening, the kind where the house was quiet and still. I was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels, barely paying attention. Emma was in the shower, her phone buzzing on the coffee table. I wasn't even tempted to check it. I'd already seen more than enough. But then something caught my eye. A message flashed across the screen, just long enough for me to catch the name. Ben. My stomach lurched. I couldn't stop myself this time. I grabbed the phone and opened it, and what I saw shattered any remaining illusions I had about our marriage. The message wasn't just a casual text. It was a plan, one that didn't involve me. Ben had asked her to meet him that weekend, at a cabin. Their anniversary, he'd called it. My chest tightened as I scrolled further back. This wasn't just a fling. They had an entire life planned behind my back. Weekends away, whispered plans about a future together, and worst of all, mocking comments about me. I was the clueless husband, the one who would never see it coming. I felt the air leave my lungs. My hands shook so violently that I dropped the phone. My vision blurred, not from anger, but from sheer devastation. They were already planning their next escape, while I sat here like a fool, thinking we could still fix what was broken. I didn't confront her that night. I couldn't. Instead, I sat in the living room, staring at the darkness outside the window, replaying every moment of our relationship. Every smile, every kiss, every time she'd said she loved me. It all felt like a lie now. When Emma finally came out of the bathroom, towel wrapped around her, she noticed something was off. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft and innocent, as if she hadn't just made plans to be with another man. I nodded, barely able to form words. "Yeah, just tired." She gave me a quick kiss on the cheek and went to bed, leaving me alone in the quiet, suffocating weight of the truth. The next few days passed in a haze, every interaction with Emma feeling like a knife twisting in my chest. I was on autopilot, going through the motions, but inside I was already planning my next move. The cabin trip was coming up that weekend, and I knew I couldn't wait any longer. It was time. That Saturday morning, Emma was in a rush. She had told me earlier in the week that she was going on a girls' weekend with some coworkers, one of those convenient excuses she'd used more often lately. She packed light, just a small overnight bag, but I knew she didn't need much for what she had planned. As she gathered her things, I stood in the kitchen, watching her every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. I had the manila folder from Carl stashed in the hallway closet, along with her phone records and screenshots of the messages. I had everything I needed, but the idea of confronting her still felt like stepping into a war zone. "You sure you don't mind?" she asked, pausing in the doorway, her eyes flickering to mine briefly. "I'll be back tomorrow night." I smiled, tight-lipped, trying to suppress the rising wave of emotions. "Of course not. Have fun." She smiled back, but it didn't reach her eyes. She had no idea what was coming. Once she left, I grabbed my car keys and followed. The drive to the cabin took about an hour, winding through the countryside until I reached a secluded area tucked between the hills. I parked a few miles away and walked the rest of the distance, my heart pounding with each step. It was as though the closer I got, the more surreal the situation became. Was this really happening? Was I really about to catch my wife in the act? The cabin was small, isolated and hidden by thick trees. I crept through the woods, keeping my distance as I approached. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the clearing. I spotted Emma's car parked in front, and my breath hitched. This was it. I circled around the back, my footsteps light on the leaves. As I got closer, I could hear faint voices coming from inside. Laughter. The kind of easy, intimate laughter we hadn't shared in a long time. The kind that now belonged to someone else. I peered through the window, and there they were, Emma and Ben, sitting close on the couch, glasses of wine in hand. She was leaning into him, her head resting on his shoulder, looking more comfortable than I'd seen her in months. It was like a punch to the gut, seeing her so happy, so content with him. For a moment, I just stood there frozen. My mind raced with conflicting emotions, rage, betrayal, sadness. But above all, I felt this overwhelming sense of loss. This was the woman I had built my life with, and here she was, building a new one without me. I don't know how long I stood there watching them. Part of me wanted to kick the door down, drag them both out into the cold, and let my anger explode. But another part of me, the part that still loved her, even after everything, held back. I didn't want to make a scene. I didn't want to lose control. I just wanted the truth out in the open. When I finally had the strength to move, I circled back to the front and knocked on the door. The sound must have startled them. I heard shuffling inside, followed by Emma's voice, uncertain. "Who is it?" I didn't answer. I just waited, heart pounding in my chest. The door opened slowly, and there she was, standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock when she saw me. Her mouth fell open, but no words came out. "Hey, Emma," I said, my voice calm, but with an edge I couldn't hide. "Can we talk?" Behind her, Ben stood up, looking like a deer caught in the headlights. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The guilt was written all over his face. Emma stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind her, as if she could somehow keep me from seeing what was inside. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I pulled out my phone, the screen lighting up with her messages to Ben. I scrolled through them, one by one, as I spoke. "You've been lying to me, Emma." For months, her face drained of color as she realized what I was holding. I can explain." "Don't," I cut her off, my voice sharper than I intended. "I don't need any more lies. I just want the truth. How long has this been going on?" She looked down, her lips trembling. A few months, she admitted, barely audible. I nodded, taking a deep breath. And what? You thought I wouldn't find out? Did I just sit at home while you ran off with him? Emma shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I didn't mean for it to happen, but it did, I finished for her, my anger finally bubbling to the surface. You cheated on me, Emma. You lied to me over and over again. And for what? For him? She flinched at my words but didn't argue. She couldn't. The truth was out now, and there was no taking it back. Behind her, the door creaked open, and Ben stepped out, looking like he wanted to disappear. I think I should go, he muttered, glancing between us. I stared at him, my blood boiling. Yeah, I think you should. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the distance. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma stood there trembling, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, she whispered. I never wanted to hurt you. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that this had all been a horrible mistake, that she still loved me, and we could somehow fix this. But looking at her now, all I could see was the betrayal, the broken promises, the years we had spent building a life together, crumbling in an instant. Sorry isn't enough, I said quietly, shaking my head. It's over, Emma. She broke down then, sobbing into her hands, but I didn't move to comfort her. I couldn't. It was too late for that. I turned and walked away, leaving her there in the cold, with nothing but the weight of what she had done. As I drove away, the reality of it all sank in. My marriage was over. The woman I loved had betrayed me in the worst way possible, and now I had to figure out how to pick up the pieces of my life without her. The drive home was a blur. I couldn't process what had just happened, my thoughts spinning in every direction. There was no relief in the confrontation, no satisfaction in exposing the truth, just an overwhelming emptiness that sat in my chest like a stone. When I got home, the house felt different, like it wasn't mine anymore. Every corner seemed tainted by memories of Emma, our life together, all of it now steeped in betrayal. The photos on the walls, the blankets on the couch, the faint scent of her perfume still lingering in the air. It was like she was haunting the place, even though she wasn't there. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing, trying to understand how everything had unraveled so quickly. A few months. That's what she had said. But I knew now it had been longer. I could see all the pieces, the things I had ignored, the lies she had slipped into our daily lives. Every time she said she was working late, every weekend trip with friends, every night she rolled over in bed, too tired to talk. It wasn't just about Ben. It was the betrayal itself, the way she had taken what we had and quietly torn it apart, leaving me to figure it out on my own. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene at the cabin over and over in my mind. The look on her face when she saw me, the way she'd tried to explain it away, like it wasn't as bad as it seemed. But it was. It was worse than I ever imagined. The next morning, I woke up to a flood of text messages from Emma. I didn't even need to open them to know what they said. Apologies, regrets, pleas for forgiveness. But there was nothing left to say. I was done. Instead, I called my lawyer. I had never seriously considered divorce before, not even in the worst of our arguments. But now, it was the only option. I couldn't stay in this marriage, not after everything that had happened. The thought of it made my skin crawl, like wearing a mask that didn't fit anymore. The lawyer was professional, calm, as though he had seen this scenario 1,000 times before. Infidelity makes things easier, at least legally, he said, his voice detached as he walked me through the process. It's an open and shut case. We'll file, and given the evidence you have, it should go through without much of a fight. It sounded so clinical, so far removed from the emotional wreckage I was living through. I could barely focus as he talked about dividing assets, handling the house, and the practicalities of ending a marriage. All I could think about was Emma's face, the way she had broken down when I walked away. The weight of it all pressed down on me like a tidal wave. I spent the next few days in a fog. Emma tried to call, but I didn't pick up. She texted, but I left them unread. I couldn't deal with her anymore. Not after everything. I needed space, time to think, time to figure out how I could move on from something this devastating. But even as I tried to block her out, my mind wouldn't stop turning. What had gone wrong? Was it something I had missed? Could I have done something differently? These questions kept swirling, making me second-guess everything about our relationship, about myself. I knew it wasn't healthy, but I couldn't help it. When your world is shattered like that, you try to make sense of the pieces, even if the answers never come. Then about a week after the confrontation, Emma showed up at the house. It was a Saturday morning. I had just sat down with a cup of coffee, trying to find some semblance of routine in the chaos, when I heard a knock at the door. I knew who it was before I even opened it. Emma stood there, looking worse than I had ever seen her. Her hair was a mess, her eyes red from crying. She was holding her phone, like she had been texting me again just moments before. "Please, just hear me out," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't want to let her in, but some part of me, maybe out of habit, maybe out of some lingering affection, stepped aside and let her through. She walked into the living room, looking around like she didn't belong there anymore. I could see the weight of her guilt in the way she carried herself, shoulders slumped, eyes avoiding mine. "I know I hurt you," she started, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "I know I ruined everything, but I need you to understand. It wasn't just about Ben. It was never just about him." I sat down on the couch staring at her. "Then what was it, Emma? Why did you do it?" She bit her lip, hesitating. "I don't know. I don't know why I let things get so bad. I just, I felt like we were losing each other. You were always so distant, so wrapped up in everything but us. And Ben, he made me feel wanted again." Her words stung, but they weren't surprising. I had heard versions of this story before, from others who had gone through the same thing. But hearing it from her, the woman I had loved for so long, made it feel like a knife twisting in my heart. "And you think that excuses what you did?" I asked, my voice cold. "You think that justifies sneaking around behind my back? Lying to me?" She shook her head, tears filling her eyes again. I'm not saying it was right. I'm just saying I was lost and I didn't know how to fix things. I made a mistake, a terrible one, but I don't want to lose you. I don't want to throw away everything we've built." There it was, the plea for forgiveness, the desperate attempt to salvage what was left. But it was too late. "I can't do this, Emma," I said, standing up. "I can't just forget what you did. I can't pretend like it didn't happen." Her face crumpled, and she reached out to me, but I stepped back, out of her reach. "Please, just give me one more chance. We can fix this. We can go to counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. I'll do anything." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that maybe somehow we could repair the damage. But deep down, I knew it wasn't possible. Trust, once broken, doesn't come back. Not like that. "I've already filed for divorce," I said quietly. The words hit her like a punch. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth, eyes wide with shock. "No, no, you didn't." "I did. It's done." She broke down completely then, sobbing into her hands, her shoulders shaking with the force of it. I watched her, feeling nothing but a deep, hollow sadness. This wasn't how I had imagined our life would turn out, but there was no going back. After a few moments, she looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small and broken. I didn't have an answer for her. All I knew was that the life we had built together was gone, and now we were both standing in the ruins, trying to figure out how to move forward. After Emma left that day, the house felt emptier than ever. The echo of her sobs seemed to linger in the air. And despite the anger, despite the hurt, a part of me felt guilty. Seeing her break down like that, seeing the raw pain on her face, it stirred something in me. But I knew, no matter how much she regretted what had happened, there was no fixing this. The cracks were too deep. The divorce process began moving forward. My lawyer filed the papers, and the legal machinery of ending a marriage slowly ground into motion. I thought I'd feel a sense of relief, but instead, there was just an overwhelming numbness. I walked through my days like a ghost, doing what needed to be done, but nothing more. The first real hurdle came when Emma tried to reach out again, just a few days after I had served the papers. I was at work when I got the call. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "I've been thinking," she said softly, her voice strained like she had been crying again. "We should talk about the house. I, I don't want to fight over it." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the paperwork scattered across my desk. "There's nothing to fight about, Emma. You can take whatever you want. I just want this over with." She sighed, and for a moment, there was silence on the line. Then she spoke again, her voice quieter. "I don't want the house. I just want you to be okay." That caught me off guard. For all the anger, all the bitterness I'd felt, here she was, still caring in her own way. But I couldn't let it sway me. Not after everything. "I'll be fine," I replied, my tone firmer than I felt. "We both will be." She was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her trying to find the right words. Do you, do you think we'll ever be able to talk again? Like after all this is over?" I didn't know what to say. The idea of ever being on friendly terms, of seeing her and not remembering all the lies, felt impossible. "I don't know, Emma. Maybe. But not now. I need space." I could hear the hurt in her voice, but she didn't push. "Okay, I understand. Just let me know if you change your mind." We ended the call, and I sat there staring at the phone, feeling the weight of her words. Even after everything, she still wanted some kind of connection. But I wasn't ready for that. I didn't know if I'd ever be ready for that. A few weeks later, I started clearing out her things. I told her she could come by and take whatever she wanted, but she hadn't shown up. I figured it was too painful for her to come back to the place where everything had fallen apart. So one evening, I decided to do it myself. I boxed up her clothes, her books, and all the little trinkets she had collected over the years. I came across photos of us on vacations, at weddings, with friends, and each one was like a punch to the gut. In those photos, we looked happy. We looked like a couple who had it all figured out. I wondered if any of it had ever been real, or if we had just been fooling ourselves. As I packed, I found something I hadn't expected. A letter. It was tucked into the back of her nightstand, folded neatly in an envelope with my name on it. My hands shook as I pulled it out and opened it, dreading what I might find. The letter was short, just a few paragraphs, but the words hit me like a hammer. "James, I'm not sure if you'll ever read this, but I needed to write it. I know I can't take back what I did. I know I've hurt you in ways I can never make up for. But I want you to know that it wasn't because I stopped loving you. I never did. Somewhere along the way, we lost each other. I don't know when it happened, but I started to feel like I wasn't good enough, like I wasn't the woman you needed anymore. And then Ben, he made me feel seen again. I'm not excusing it. I know it was wrong, but I wanted you to know that it wasn't because you weren't enough. It was me. I'll regret this for the rest of my life, and I understand if you never forgive me. But I hope one day you can find it in your heart to move on and find happiness again. You deserve that. Love always, Emma." I read the letter over and over again, each time feeling the knot in my chest tighten. I wanted to hate her. I wanted to stay angry. But the letter made it harder. She wasn't just the villain in this story. She was a flawed, broken person who had made a terrible mistake. And part of me wondered if I had been too focused on my own pain to see hers. But that didn't change the fact that our marriage was over. No amount of regret could undo what had been done. The days bled into weeks, and slowly I started to adjust to life without her. The house felt emptier, but in some ways, it was a relief. I didn't have to pretend anymore. I didn't have to look at her and wonder where she'd been, what lies she was telling me. One Saturday afternoon, I decided to finally take down our wedding photo from the living room wall. It had been there since we moved in, a constant reminder of the life we'd built together. As I stood there staring at it, I felt the weight of all the years, the good and the bad, pressing down on me. With a deep breath, I took the photo off the wall and placed it in a box. I didn't throw it away. I wasn't ready for that yet, but it was time to put it away, to start moving forward. That night, I sat in the living room, staring at the empty space on the wall where the photo used to hang. It felt like a metaphor for my life. Something was missing, but maybe that was okay. Maybe it was time to start filling that space with something new. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if I'd ever trust someone again, or if I'd be able to rebuild what had been shattered. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. The wounds were still fresh, the scars not yet formed, but I knew that one day I'd look back on all of this and see it for what it was, a painful, necessary part of my journey. I wasn't there yet, but I was getting closer. As the weeks stretched into months, the divorce became more of a reality than just paperwork. The process was smooth, at least on the surface. Emma didn't contest anything, and we quickly divided up what little we had left to argue over: the house, the bank accounts, and the few sentimental items we once shared. Every legal milestone brought me closer to the finality of it all, yet the emotional weight remained heavy. I found myself in a strange limbo, a place between grief and acceptance. It was like I had been walking through life blindfolded, and now with Emma gone, the blindfold had been removed. But instead of clarity, I felt disoriented. Everything that once seemed so sure, my marriage, my future, was gone, and now I had to rebuild from scratch. One night as I sat alone in the house, I decided to take a step forward. I had spent too long dwelling on the past, going over every moment of our relationship, every mistake, every lie. I couldn't keep living like this. So I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I called up my closest friend Dave. Dave and I had known each other for years, but we hadn't spoken much since the divorce began. I had pushed everyone away, thinking I needed to deal with this on my own. But when Dave answered the phone, it was like no time had passed. "James, man, I've been waiting for this call," he said, his voice light with relief. "I was starting to think you were going to stay holed up in that house forever." I smiled for the first time in what felt like weeks. "Yeah, well, I figured it was time to come out of hiding." We made plans to meet up the next night. It wasn't anything big, just a couple of beers at our favorite pub, but it felt like the first real step toward reclaiming my life. That night, as I sat at the bar with Dave, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time: normalcy. We didn't talk about the divorce much. Dave knew the details, and he didn't push for more. Instead, we laughed, we reminisced, and for the first time in months, I felt like myself again. It was a small moment, but it was enough to remind me that life existed beyond the wreckage of my marriage. After that, I started saying yes to more things. I reconnected with friends I had neglected during the darkest days of the separation, went out more, tried new things. At first it felt forced, like I was going through the motions just to fill the silence. But slowly, something started to shift. The outings became less about distraction and more about rediscovering the parts of me that had been buried beneath years of a relationship that no longer fit. One weekend, Dave convinced me to join him on a camping trip with a few of our old college friends. It wasn't something I would have normally done, especially not after the emotional chaos I had been through. But when he asked, I couldn't think of a reason to say no. And maybe deep down, I needed to get out of town, away from the house that held so many memories of Emma. We drove up to the mountains, and as soon as we arrived, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. The air was crisp, the trees towering over us like silent sentinels. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the weight of my divorce pressing down on me. It was just me, the wilderness, and the chance to let go. That night, as we sat around the campfire, I found myself opening up to the guys about what had happened with Emma. It wasn't something I had planned to do, but the combination of the firelight, the stars overhead, and the quiet of the mountains made it feel like the right time. "I didn't see it coming," I admitted, staring into the flames. "I thought we were fine, you know? I thought we were building something real, but I guess maybe I wasn't paying attention." Dave, sitting next to me, shook his head. "It's not your fault, man. She made her choice. That doesn't mean you were blind. It just means she wasn't the person you thought she was." I nodded, letting his words sink in. I had been blaming myself for so long. Blaming myself for not seeing the signs, for not being enough, for letting it happen. But maybe he was right. Maybe it wasn't all on me. Another friend, Mike, chimed in. "People change, James. Sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. It sucks when it happens like this, but you can't keep punishing yourself for it." As we talked, I realized something I hadn't before. I wasn't just grieving the loss of my marriage. I was grieving the loss of who I had been with Emma. For so long, my identity had been wrapped up in being her husband, in building our life together. Without that, I felt like I had lost a part of myself. But maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe this was my chance to start over, to figure out who I was outside of her shadow. When we got back from the camping trip, I felt lighter, more sure of myself. The house still felt empty, but it no longer felt like a tomb. I started making small changes, rearranging furniture, redecorating, turning it into a space that reflected who I was now, not who I had been when Emma and I lived there together. One afternoon, I went through the box of things I had packed away: our wedding photos, mementos from trips we had taken, the life we had shared. I didn't throw them out, but I tucked them away in the attic. It wasn't about forgetting. It was about letting go. The divorce was finalized a few months later. When the papers came in the mail, I sat there for a long time, staring at them. I had imagined this moment over and over again, thinking it would feel like closure, like the final chapter in a book. But when it came, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of something new. Emma and I hadn't spoken since that day she came by the house. I wondered how she was doing, if she had moved on, if she had found whatever it was she had been searching for with Ben. But I didn't reach out. I knew that chapter of my life was closed, and opening it again wouldn't do either of us any good. Instead, I focused on the future. It wasn't easy, and there were still days when the pain would hit me out of nowhere, when I'd think about what we had lost. But those days became fewer and farther between, and each time they did, I found it easier to keep moving forward. One night, after months of trying to piece myself back together, I sat down at the kitchen table with a glass of whiskey and looked around the house. It was different now, in small but important ways. The walls were painted a new color, the furniture rearranged, the air lighter. It felt like mine again. I raised my glass to the empty room, a quiet toast to the journey I had been on and the one that still lay ahead. Here's to moving on. After the divorce papers were signed, there was an odd sense of relief. I thought I'd feel broken, shattered even, but instead I felt lighter. It was like a weight had been lifted, a heavy, suffocating burden I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for so long. The months leading up to this moment had been filled with anger, confusion, and heartbreak, but now there was a strange, quiet peace. I took that peace as a sign to move forward, to start rebuilding the pieces of my life. It wasn't about rushing into something new or forcing myself to get over the past. It was about taking small steps, one at a time, toward the person I wanted to become. One of the first things I did was reconnect with my family. I had distanced myself from them during the breakdown of my marriage, partly out of embarrassment, partly out of shame. My parents knew something was wrong, but I had brushed off their concerns with vague excuses and half-hearted reassurances that things would get better. Now, with the divorce finalized, I realized how much I needed them, how much I missed the comfort of their presence. That weekend, I made the drive to my parents' house. It was a sunny Saturday, and as I pulled into the driveway, I felt a wave of nostalgia wash over me. This was the house I had grown up in, the place where I had always felt safe, and for the first time in a long time, I needed that feeling. My mom greeted me at the door with a warm hug, the kind only mothers can give. She didn't ask any probing questions or offer unsolicited advice. She just held me for a moment, then pulled me inside, where the smell of freshly baked bread filled the air. Dad was sitting at the kitchen table, reading the paper like he always did on Saturday mornings. When he saw me, he smiled and patted the chair next to him. "Good to see you, son." I sat down, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I relaxed. We didn't talk about the divorce at first. Instead, we talked about normal things. My brother's new job, my cousin's wedding, the weather. It felt good to just be part of a normal conversation, free from the drama and tension that had dominated my life for so long. But eventually, the topic came up. My mom, ever gentle, placed a hand on my arm and said, "James, you know we're here for you, right? You don't have to go through this alone." I nodded, swallowing the lump that had formed in my throat. "I know, Mom. I didn't want to burden you with everything." "You're our son," my dad chimed in, his voice steady and calm. "There's nothing you could tell us that would be a burden." I took a deep breath, letting their words sink in. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that, how much I needed to know that they were still there for me, even after everything. So I told them the truth. I told them about Emma, about the affair, about how I had tried so hard to make things work, only to watch it all fall apart. They listened, not interrupting or offering solutions, just listening. And by the time I finished, I felt lighter, like a weight I had been carrying for months had finally been lifted. "We're proud of you, James," my mom said, her eyes soft with compassion. "You did everything you could, and now it's time to move forward." Dad nodded in agreement. "You've got a lot of life ahead of you. Don't let this define it." I stayed with them for the rest of the day, talking, reminiscing, and just being together. It was exactly what I needed. A reminder that no matter how much had changed, some things would always stay the same. My family would always be my anchor, the place I could return to when everything else seemed uncertain. Over the next few months, I focused on rebuilding myself. I started taking care of my body again, working out, eating better, and getting back into hobbies I had abandoned during the marriage. I took up hiking, something I hadn't done in years, and found peace in the quiet of the mountains, the fresh air clearing my mind in a way nothing else could. I also threw myself into work. My career had taken a back seat during the mess of the divorce, but now I was more determined than ever to refocus. I started working longer hours, pushing myself to take on new projects, and within a few months I had landed a promotion. It felt good to succeed at something, to feel like I was moving forward instead of being stuck in the past. But it wasn't just about work or hobbies. I knew I needed to face the emotional side of things too. So, I started seeing a therapist. At first I was skeptical, unsure if talking to a stranger would really help. But after a few sessions I realized how much I had been holding inside, how much pain and anger I had buried beneath the surface. Therapy helped me unpack all of that. It wasn't easy. Some days it felt like I was ripping open old wounds, but it was necessary. Slowly I began to understand that healing wasn't about forgetting what had happened. It was about accepting it, learning from it, and figuring out how to move forward. One of the hardest realizations I came to was that I hadn't just lost Emma. I had lost a version of myself in that marriage. I had become so wrapped up in being her husband, in trying to fix what was broken, that I had forgotten who I was outside of that role. Therapy helped me see that it was okay to grieve not just the relationship, but the person I had been. And once I let myself feel that grief, I could finally start to heal. It wasn't long after that I received a message from Emma. It was short, just a text that read, "I've signed the final papers. I hope you're doing okay." I stared at the message for a long time, unsure of how to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to just let the silence speak for itself. But another part of me, the part that still remembered the good times, the part that still cared, even after everything, felt like I owed her something. So I replied, "I'm doing okay. I hope you are too." That was it. Nothing more needed to be said. It felt like the final chapter of our story had been written. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic goodbyes, just a quiet acknowledgement that we had both moved on. As the months passed, life slowly started to fall into place again. I found joy in the small things. Weekends spent hiking, dinners with friends, lazy Sundays reading in the backyard. The house, once filled with memories of Emma, now felt like mine. It was no longer a reminder of what I had lost, but a symbol of what I had rebuilt. I wasn't naive enough to think I was fully healed. There were still days when the pain would creep in, when I'd wonder what might have been if things had gone differently. But those days were fewer now, and each time they came, I found it easier to push through them. And one day, while sitting on the porch watching the sunset, I realized something. I was happy. It wasn't the kind of happiness I had once imagined, tied to a marriage, a family, the future I had planned with Emma. It was quieter, more subtle, but it was real. I had survived the worst of it, and now I was ready for whatever came next. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges of pain. As the months rolled on, life started to feel less like a struggle and more like an open road, one I could navigate on my own terms. It wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about finding a way to live with it, without letting it define me. A year had passed since the divorce was finalized. I could look back now without feeling like I was drowning in it. There were still moments of sadness, brief flashes when I'd see something that reminded me of Emma, of the life we once had. But they didn't hold the same weight anymore. They were just memories, part of my story, but not the whole of it. One afternoon, as I was cleaning out the attic, I came across the box of old photos and keepsakes from my marriage. I hadn't opened it since the day I packed it away, and for a moment, I hesitated. I wasn't sure if I was ready to face those memories again. But instead of shoving the box back into the corner, I sat down and opened it. Inside were snapshots of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Photos of Emma and me on vacation, our wedding day, our first apartment together. There was even the dried bouquet she had carried down the aisle. I held the flowers for a long time, running my fingers over the brittle petals. There was no anger anymore, no bitterness, just a quiet acceptance that life was over, but it had been real, and for a long time, it had been good. I wasn't going to throw the box away. I wasn't trying to erase the past, but I was ready to close that chapter for good. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. I was at a local bookstore, killing time on a Saturday afternoon. I'd developed a habit of wandering into shops like this, finding solace in the quiet corners and the smell of old books. As I flipped through a novel, I heard a voice behind me. "James, is that you?" I turned around and was met with a face I hadn't seen in years. It was Lauren, an old friend from college. We had been close back then, but life had pulled us in different directions, and we'd lost touch. Now, standing in front of her, it felt like no time had passed at all. Lauren! Wow, it's been forever, I said, smiling as I pulled her into a hug. She laughed. I know. What are you doing in this little corner of the world? We spent the next hour catching up, sharing stories about what had happened in the years since we'd last seen each other. Lauren had gone through her own ups and downs, moving cities, changing careers, a brief marriage that had ended in divorce. There was an instant connection between us, a shared understanding of what it meant to rebuild after everything had fallen apart. By the time we left the bookstore, we had exchanged numbers and made plans to meet up again. It wasn't a date, not exactly, but there was an undeniable spark. It felt good to connect with someone who understood where I had been, someone who had been through their own journey of healing. Over the next few months, Lauren and I became close. We'd grab coffee, go for hikes, spend hours talking about everything from our failed relationships to our hopes for the future. There was no rush, no pressure to define what we were. We were just two people who had found each other at the right time. But as we spent more time together, it became clear that this wasn't just a friendship. There was something deeper, something I hadn't expected to find so soon after my divorce. One evening, after we'd spent the day hiking through the mountains, we sat on a hill overlooking the valley, the sky painted in shades of pink and orange as the sun set. Lauren turned to me, her eyes soft, her expression open. Do you ever think about what comes next? She asked, her voice quiet, as if she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. I looked at her, the woman who had somehow become such an important part of my life, and for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. Yeah, I said, reaching for her hand. I think about it a lot. She smiled, and in that moment, I realized something important. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't afraid of getting hurt, of being vulnerable, of letting someone in again. The fear that had once kept me paralyzed, that had made me think I could never love again, was gone. We sat there watching the sun dip below the horizon, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt at peace. Months passed, and what had started as friendship between Lauren and me slowly grew into something more. We didn't rush into anything, but it became clear that we were both ready for whatever was coming next. I wasn't the same person I had been with Emma. I was stronger now, more self-assured, more aware of what I wanted and needed in a relationship. Lauren wasn't a replacement for Emma. She was something entirely different, someone who understood me in a way that felt natural and easy, without the weight of the past hanging over us. With her, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything or fix anything. I could just be myself. One evening, nearly 2 years after my divorce was finalized, I found myself standing on the front porch of my house, looking out at the stars. Lauren was inside, laughing with Dave and a few other friends, and I could hear their voices floating through the open window. The house, once a place of loneliness and heartache, now felt alive again. I stood there thinking about everything that had led me to this moment, the heartbreak, the pain, the slow process of healing. There had been moments when I thought I'd never get here, moments when the grief had been too much to bear. But now, standing on the other side of it all, I realized how far I had come. The road hadn't been easy, and there were still scars that would never fully fade. But I had survived. I had rebuilt. And now, with Lauren by my side, I was ready to start the next chapter. As I stepped back inside into the warmth and light of the house, I smiled. Life hadn't turned out the way I'd planned, but maybe that was okay. Maybe, just maybe, it had turned out exactly the way it was supposed to.